Hey everyone, Coach Micah here, and welcome back to another Theory Thursday episode. I appreciate your patience with me. I had to delay this week's Theory Thursday episode from last week, and that's because I was coaching my students at their local tournament. They all did very well, and I'm really proud of them. If you're watching this video, guys, well done. Anyways, if you guys want to become a student, then feel free to reach out to me at coachmicahdiaz@gmail.com. I'd love to meet with you in advance of your next local tournament and figure out how to get you on that podium. But anyways, what we're going to be talking about today is, of course, voting issues, as you may have seen from my teaser post a few days ago. Because at the end of the day, and at the end of the round, I should say, the judge is often left with a large pile of arguments. The weeds, as you may have heard them referred to, just murky waters, and for a lot of debates, unfortunately, that aren't very organized or clear, or there's not a lot of clash. The debate ends and the judge simply has no idea what they're going to do or how they're going to judge. Oftentimes you didn't tell them enough, and so when they give you your reason for a decision, it seems like they just injected their own opinion. But ultimately, that's because you didn't give them enough information to go off of. They kind of had to use some sort of opinion in order to pull from what you're trying to say. So the purpose of today's video is hopefully to help you realize how you can tie up the round neatly, package it up, nice little bow, and give something for the judge to vote on. If these videos are helpful for you, or you have some other ideas and you want to see this channel grow and to get bigger and expand into new areas, then please hit that subscribe button and of course like today's video. We got a lot of preparation to come for the next resolution. I'm working diligently on getting some resources ready for that. And of course, Night Talk is not too far away, just a few more months, and I'm really excited to see you all there. Anyways, without further ado, let's get straight into it. Voting issues are not as simple as I think a lot of debaters make them out to be. There's a lot more that goes into creating good, persuasive voting issues. And of course, before we go there, we need to understand what a voting issue is, and of course, why you need a voting issue. Well, simply put, a voting issue is a reason why the judge or judges should vote for you. There's three things that voting issues need to do, right? The first is they have to be tagged. You have to, and a lot of you already know this, but if you don't, you need to tag your voting issues. The judge needs to write down your voting issue on their flow so that they can look back at it later, which means you can strategize what your tags are. And we'll go through some examples a few slides down, but they're going to be tagged. Next is they're going to summarize key points of the debate. Emphasis on key. You could end up in a situation where you have an abundance of time and you can simply run as many voting issues as you want. We'll get to how feasible that is in a second. But ultimately, you are summarizing the key points of the round. And of course, voting issues will conclude your last speech. They don't exist in your first speech. They don't exist in the negatives second out of 3 speeches, just the last speech, and oftentimes within the last 30 seconds. Once again, we'll get to the timing there later. I really like what former coach Travis Hirsch, who wrote the book Keys to Lincoln Douglas Debate, which is still available from Monument Publishing. He talks about the experience and the strategy of running a voting issue and kind of the idea and the mindset behind it. He says, quote, "That's the feeling that you should have when you get up for the NR or 2AR, negative rebuttal, or second affirmative rebuttal. The round is done. You're not going to explain why you should win, but why you already have won. Speak of the round in past tense, and most importantly, focus the speech on ways that you won." So when you go up there for your voting issues, rather than talk about here's why I should win today's debate, you change the rhetoric a little bit, and rhetoric is extremely important. I will preach that till the day I die. You tweak your rhetoric a little bit and say, here's why I have won today's debate round. There's 3 reasons why I have won. My first voting issue you can write down as blank, right? If you copy that phrasing right there, that'll serve you well in your debate rounds. Of course, the next thing we need to talk about is how we actually run a voting issue. Remember how we talked about finding key points of the debate and creating a memorable tag? How do you pick and choose which things to point out in your voting issues? So let's start with the idea of finding a key point of the debate. And I'm going to use some examples of just different arguments here, but you can input different values, for example. So first off, let's say that you're affirmative. We're assuming that we're affirmative and we're getting up for our last speech. We're going to, the key point of the debate is the value, because this is a Lincoln Douglas values debate. So whichever side upholds the value wins the round. So my first voting issue is going to be how the value of human rights stands. So I am going to talk about how my side of the resolution upholds the value within this. And of course, within my voting issue, I need to include rhetoric that shows how I actually have met the voting issue. I can't just say, well, Judge, today the value is won by me, moving on. When you make a voting issue, you have to explain it. You have to bring the impact to it. You should never just give the tag and move on, because that doesn't hold any weight in the judge's mind. Don't feel like you have 5 seconds left. You're going to get one last voting issue in there and the timer's going to go off and you're just going to stop, but the judge got it on their flow, so therefore you're going to win. That's not realistic. So find the time to put the rhetoric and the actual impact into the arguments when you make your voting issue. Another key point of the debate could be that your opponent dropped all of your arguments. And of course, when you're running a voting issue, you talk about how significant that is. Why is it important that your opponent dropped all of your arguments? Well, ultimately, in a debate round, you are conflicting with each other. You have conflicting ideas that have either logical backing or real world backing or both. And if your opponent does not refute them, meaning your opponent does not prove that they are wrong, then we have to assume that they are right. That's just how debate works. So if your opponent drops all of your arguments, well then ultimately in the debate round, whether you agree with them or not, the arguments do stand. And by the definition of debate, I win. Because the whole point is I have to refute my opponent's arguments and they have to refute mine. Now I want to interject here and say that sometimes it seems like you get your ballots back and the judges really didn't care that your opponent dropped their arguments. And oftentimes, if you try to say, well, regardless, I win, it seems like the opponents have the judges have their own ideas and will bring up their own points as if they are an extension of the debater. So when you're talking about your opponent dropping your arguments, you have to explain it in a way that makes sense and in a way that communicates the opponent has failed their burden, for example. So I might say, my opponent has dropped all of my arguments, and here's why that matters. In a Lincoln Douglas debate round, if my opponent, whose burden it is to prove the resolution false, cannot prove the resolution false, then I win. That's just how it works. And his arguments that he brought up, we've already proven they're not true. Statistically, logically, realistically, they're just not true. That don't exist. But we have shown that my arguments are true, and my opponent has failed to prove why they're not. So at the end of the day, all of the arguments flow towards my side, which means that I've won today's debate round. Moving on. Something like that, right? The third type of key point in a debate that you can point out is, of course, the idea that your opponent's arguments fall. So not necessarily they dropped your arguments, but their arguments have no weight. And we're going to have future resources on refutation and what that looks like. But if you've done your refutation, you could point out in a voting issue how your opponent's arguments have no weight. Generally, this is probably as I would go through 1 through 4, I kind of rank these in the idea of importance, because most of the time you're not going to have 4 voting issues. But if you do have the time, yeah, I would run a voting issue talking about how your opponent's arguments fall. And then I might have another voting issue talking about how your applications outweigh all else. In fact, switch that. Try to prioritize talking about yourself as much as possible. I'm going to interject here again. When you talk about yourself and your own points, your opponent's points are going to be less and less memorable, because the judge can only retain so much information. Scientifically, you can only retain so much of the information that you hear. So if your opponent focuses on your case and you focus on your case, then all the brain power from the judge is going to your case, whether it's good or bad. It's thinking about your arguments and not about your opponent's arguments. And that's key. And if we can find a time or find a way to spend as much time as possible focusing on your own points, especially with your voting issues, then we lessen the impact and the memorability of your opponent's points. So basically put number 4 at number 3, number 3 at number 4, right? Your opponent's arguments fall is probably the last option. You instead want to prioritize how your applications outweigh. And maybe you have a little impact in there of how those fall. And we'll talk about structuring a voting issue soon. So that's what you would look at the key points of the debate. Now here is what the voting issue would look like, you know, from the cross between 1 and 1, right? So for the value of human rights stands, my voting issue tag is going to be incrementalism upholds human rights. If your opponent dropped your arguments, let's say that's the main form of the debate, both of you agreed the value of standing, if you basically have to have some sort of value clash to make that make sense. But let's say you both agreed on the values and you're fighting in the trenches now. You're going to talk about how your opponent dropped your arguments. I might say negative couldn't refute, or incrementalism proven true, right? And this kind of goes into the idea of you could honestly use the same tag, incrementalism upholds human rights. And honestly, that's probably what I would do. If your opponent's arguments fall, I would say radicalism unproven. Another voting issue for today, the reason why I won today's round is because radicalism has been ultimately unproven in the debate round. We can only look at hypothetical examples. We can look at idealistic scenarios, but we can never truly understand what it looks like in the real world from the negative perspective. We can from the affirmative perspective, which proves that radicalism does not uphold human rights and therefore affirmative wins the round. Something like that, right? And then when you're talking about how your applications outweigh all else, you're going to have a voting issue talking about how incrementalism is more significant. So because we're talking about superiority here, significance is key. Because if something is incredibly insignificant, then we wouldn't necessarily argue that it's superior. At least not with the weight of the word superior. Superior like carries a larger weight than, you know, better might. So, and a final tip for you here, compare and contrast your voting issues. That's what I like to do with my voting issues and what I teach my students. If incrementalism upholds human rights, then that must mean radicalism harms human rights, right? Because you do have to talk a little bit about how your opponent fails the round. If you don't have enough time, then of course you only talk about how you uphold the round, or uphold the resolution, excuse me. But you could compare and contrast if you have the time. Time management is your friend when it comes to voting issues. So I like to ask myself the question, you know, when the judge goes back to the judging lounge and they're looking down at their flow, and they're looking down at the things that they wrote down because you told them to write them down, what are they going to see? What exactly did you have them write down? The wording of your tags matter. But now that we know how to run a voting issue, we know what to focus on, what exactly do I do now? And that really depends on how much time you have left in the round. And there's different strategies for your voting issues depending on how much time you have left. Now, these boxes here show those strategies. The last one on the end is just for the affirmative, but we'll talk about that here in a second. So let's say that you have either, for the negative, you have 1.5 to 2 minutes left. After all the arguments, you have 2 minutes left, up to 2 minutes left to do your points. And AF only has 30 seconds. You could have 1 to 4 voting issues, right? But ultimately, you're going to, if you're affirmative, you will probably have 1 voting issue, and it's going to be the key issue of the round, right? You should not have only 30 seconds left before you get into your voting issues on affirmative. But if you are in that scenario, you're going to pick the biggest, most important part of the debate, and you're going to run a voting issue on that, and you're going to spend all 30 seconds of it proving that voting issue true. Either whether it be subpoints or impacts, that's what you're going to do. So you're going to give summaries, right? That's the main type of voting issue. A summarized voting issue is one that does not have any extra tags. It's just the tag itself and then rhetoric underneath it. And that rhetoric needs to be strong, but ultimately the tag is what's carrying you forward. If you have a little bit more time, for example, the neg has 2 to 3.5 minutes left, they can create deeper and more expansive subpointed voting issues with multiple levels to them, multiple tagged reasons why that voting issue is so significant. So you have one tag, but then you have multiple ideas. So like, let's say you had that voting issue, incrementalism upholds human rights. My subpoint A would probably be applications. My subpoint B would be real world analysis, right? And then an impact following that would include, therefore, I have won today's debate round, right? Now, there is a strategy for the affirmative. Let's say the round is incredibly messy and you know it, and being aware is your friend in LD. But let's say you just noticed that, yeah, this round is incredibly messy and I need to shore it up. You're going to spend your entire speech only running voting issues. You're not going to cross-apply anything. You don't need to cross-apply anything. The judge is already confused as it is. So you're going to spend your entire speech running voting issues. You're not going to bring up any rebuttive arguments. You're not going to rebut any arguments. There will be no rebuttal. You're simply going to present positive reasons why you win. And of course, summarize your opponent's stance and your stance on your opponent in a voting issue on why they lost. You're going to have subpoints and impacts. And you could, if you're the type of person that is incredibly organized and you're able to do that effectively, then yes, you can respond to the negative throughout your voting issues. However, it's risky because that's incredibly disorganized if you do it wrong. And it's very easy to do it wrong. So I would recommend, if you're in the weeds and there's just a lot of stuff going on, you need to just give the entire attention of your 3 minutes to bringing it back on track and talking about why you have won the round. Here's an example of what a summarized voting issue looks like. So you've just got just enough time for a few short voting issues. So I might say something like, with that, there are several reasons why I win today's debate. My first voting issue you can tag as incrementalism upholds human rights. Whether it be the civil rights movement gradually accepting equality, or government policies consistently creating an atmosphere of progress that upholds society, it's clear to see that incrementalism is the way to achieve human rights within societal change. My second voting issue you can tag as radicalism harms human rights. It's clear that in the real world, large sweeping changes harm human rights, regardless of the intentions. Unfortunately, a functioning society isn't designed to implode every time there's an issue, harming our rights or preventing our rights from being stable. So, something like that, right? Now, I will say this is just an example, but part of your rhetoric needs to include the idea of what rights are being upheld. And generally, you're going to talk about what the rights are that are relevant to the debate in your definition of human rights, if that is your value. And this doesn't necessarily have to be your value. You're going to be applying this information to your own value, but do you get the idea? Very simple. I'm using the words that reference arguments that I know the judge has already heard, but I'm not making them a tag. I'm just giving a really quick, short summary because I don't have much time left. But of course, if you have a little bit more time, you're going to bring in some subpoints and some impact. A little extra impact to make your points go a long way. So your voting issue might sound like this. My first voting issue you can tag as incrementalism upholds human rights. Throughout this round, we've clearly seen that incrementalism is the way to achieve human rights within societal change, and it's why I have won the round. Let's look at this in a few ideas. My subpoint you can write down as civil rights movement. This application stands out in this debate as the only one my opponent didn't address. Yet, this example clearly shows how a society sought to incrementally change, not radically. Might add a little bit of impact there and also add something like, and the civil rights movement made our society better. It upheld human rights, right? Subpoint B, healthcare. Incrementalism happens through gradual policy change, and the betterment of our healthcare system each and every year is due to incremental change. In other words, incrementalism supports our rights down to the ability to live. Now, we're assuming that this was a greater application brought up throughout the debate round, right? Impact, incrementalism is superior. As the affirmative, I have shown the resolution to be true. Incrementalism is superior because human rights are supported and social change is positive, which means I warrant your ballot today. Moving on. So you have just enough time as the affirmative, maybe you have a minute left or even a minute and a half. You can start giving some expanded voting issues. Here's what a sole focus voting issue strategy looks like. You might start off your speech with, "It is because the agreed upon framework of this round supports my side and disproves my opponents. I warrant your ballot today." With that, I have 3 main reasons why I won the round. My first voting issue you can tag as blank, right? And remember, you're not going to respond to your opponent's points. You're going to skip that part actually and just go straight into the speech. Now, you will only do a sole focus strategy for your voting issues if one of the 3 things happens. So let's say that there is a key piece of framework that you win the round because that piece of framework exists or was agreed upon. Nothing else matters because of that framework. So you talk about how a key definition or analysis point that your opponent dropped wins the round. It can be as simple as that. Judge, this round has gotten very muddy, and that's okay because I have the life preserver and we're gonna get out really quick. At the beginning of the round, my opponent agreed to a definition of mine, but then proceeded to forget what that definition actually says. Now, definitions basically show what we're talking about today, which means all of my opponent's points and their responses come from a skewed view of an analysis point that they didn't respond to, or that they dropped, or that they misunderstood. And I've attempted to help them out this debate round, but they've failed to see how that is relevant. Well, ultimately, the round is over. I have won the round because my opponent was not on the right side of the round. So you could say something like that. Let's say that your opponent just was a hypothetical person, didn't provide any real world examples. Then you're gonna skip all of the last responses in your 3-minute speech, and you're just going to solely talk about how my opponent just doesn't exist in the real world. Their side doesn't happen. There's no evidence to support it. They've only talked about hypothetical examples, which means regardless of whether mine are perfect or not is not the question. It's just that there's real world proof that incrementalism upholds the resolution, is more significant and therefore more superior than radicalism. Now, again, I just want to point out the reason a sole focus strategy doesn't work for the negatives because you have 6 minutes and you absolutely have to respond to arguments. So a sole focus is only a strategy that could be used for the last affirmative rebuttal because you only have 3 minutes and you have to make those 3 minutes count. Another reason you could just skip everything in your last rebuttal and just go straight to the voting issues is if your opponent just provided no responses, or the responses that they provided were just retelling of the arguments they are made in the past. A lot of people do that. They have tags of their arguments and then they don't actually bring up anything new. They just continually bringing up the same arguments, and that's a problem, which means you can point that out without having to respond to anything that your opponent says. Within these 3 strategies, there are a couple things to remember about voting issues. You need to be persuasive. You need to be likable. At the end of the day, you're not debating your opponent. And we'll talk about this here in a second, but you're speaking to the judge. The judge is the one who gives you the win, not the opponent. So if you can center the round back on something the judge will care about, it's going to give you a higher advantage and a higher likelihood of winning that round. So when you're doing a voting issue, the first thing you need to remember is you have to have a voting issue. Never, ever, ever forget to have a voting issue. Even if it's just got to be one, you need to have one. And it needs to be impactful. It needs to be persuasive, right? Your tags need to be memorable. Make them short, simple, and straight to the point. Voting issue 1, incrementalism upholds human rights. Now, human rights, incrementalism, those things are longer words, and unfortunately with a resolution with as many long words as this one is, your voting issues will be a little longer. But for the next resolution, practical skills and knowledge, skills uphold blank, knowledge upholds blank, right? Anything that's this upholds that. That is a shortened version of it. Or my second voting issue you can write down as real world impact, right? Another thing you want to do is focus on positive arguments. Remember, we talked about this earlier, and while sometimes you have to talk about your opponent, you want to try to spin the rhetoric to say that you won. I won today's round. Not, here's why my opponent lost. Rather, here is why I have won the round. The last thing that you need to remember is that you are speaking to the judge, not at the judge. The judge is who can determine whether or not you win the tournament. The judge determines whether or not you get the right seeding to give you the best advantage to win a tournament, not your opponent. You and your opponent can talk about how you beat each other all you like, but the judge is who matters. So make sure that you communicate to them and make it the best that you can. Now, I'm going to have future resources available here on how to do that, how to speak to different types of judges, and how to use your strengths and parts of your personality and to sound as persuasive and be as likable as possible. But until then, just remember, keep everything clear, simple, organized, persuasive, be emphatic, be impactful, and adding your own personal conviction to your arguments, to your voting issues, are what's going to give them the oomph and the strength to carry into the judge's lounge, in the judge's mind, and ultimately onto your ballot in the form of circling a win for your side. The new resolution is a few weeks away, so be on the lookout for resources that I will be posting here and my Patreon page. Link will be in the description, as I will be shortly releasing another document that examines the resolution. I have done this for the past 2 resolutions, and I think what I want to do this time is equip it with an explanation video, one that will be available when you use that resource there. So make sure you keep your eyes open. Of course, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me, whether it be my email, coachmicahdiaz@gmail.com, or you can comment on these videos or engage with the posts and the community posts there. I want to make sure that I create relevant content for you, especially as we get closer and closer to the national tournament. Anyways, thank you so much for watching today's video. I will see you in the next one.